Good morning. I'd like to call to order the Subcommittee on Government Operations. Welcome everyone this morning. Beautiful day in Washington. Welcome to my colleague, our ranking member, Mr. Conley, and we'll have an introduction of Mr. Posey and acceptance of him into the committee's proceedings today.
If just before you begin your statement,
Yes.
if you wouldn't mind, I'd ask unanimous consent that our colleague from Florida, Mr. Posey, be allowed to participate in today's hearing.
Without objection, so ordered.
I thank the Chair.
Thank you. Well, again, I'd like to welcome everyone. The order of business will be opening statements by members, and we have, I see 3 witnesses this morning. We'll go to our panel of witnesses after we've heard from the members. We'll hear from our 3 witnesses and welcome them this morning. And then we'll go into questions. So that'll be the order of business. And the title of today's hearing is Examining the Federal Response to Autism Spectrum Disorders. And this is a hearing that the chairman, Mr. Issa, had also committed to conduct, and we're pleased to cooperate in conducting today's important hearing. First of all, we always have an opening statement about the purpose of the committee, and we do have important work. We're the chief investigative and oversight panel in the House of Representatives and probably in the Congress, and it's important responsibility. When you're home like we were last week, there's people working hard, making a living, trying to feed their families, keep up with all the responsibilities that they have as citizens. And they send us here to make certain that government is efficient, effective, and it works for them. Today's a particularly important hearing because it deals with the affliction that many families have had to experience, unfortunately, with their children, autism, and it has impacted dramatically their lives. And we'll hear in just a few minutes and some of the questions that are being raised right now about federal response and federal programs. So it is important that we, in fact, review what's going on with these programs, especially the federal aspects and their impact, again, on the issue of autism and problem that so many family and children face. So, again, thank you for coming, and as I said, the hearing is going to try to focus on government's response also to the rise in the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorders, or ASD. We'll hear from some distinguished witnesses who hopefully can shed light on, again, the federal perspective that we're centering and focusing our attention on today. In March, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, they issued a report that estimates that now 1 in 68 children in the United States has been identified with ASD. This estimate's roughly 30% higher than CDC's estimate from 2 years ago, which showed ASD in 1 in 88 children. ASD causes, of course, some very significant financial burdens for diagnosed individuals and their families. Individuals with autism, on average, spend $4,110 to $6,220 more on medical expenditures every year than individuals without ASD. In 2011, the additional cost of having a child with ASD was estimated to be more than $17,000 a year. In the United States, spending on autism costs $126 billion every year, including associated costs for health care, education, intervention services, as well as wages lost by parents who sometimes have to quit their jobs to care for their children. The federal government also spends money on autism, and that's one of the things we're going to review today. In FY 2012, Congress appropriated not a huge sum, but significant money, $230 million for autism-specific research and services. This includes $161 million for research for the National Institutes of Health, $21 million for CDC surveillance and research efforts, and some $48 million for Health Resources and Services Administration within HHS, and another $5 million for autism research within the Department of Defense's congressionally directed medical research program. Of course, the Federal Government has an important responsibility, and that's to ensure that these funds are spent both effectively and also efficiently. In 2006, Congress established the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, IACC. That agency and committee coordinates all efforts within the Department of Health and Human Services and other Federal agencies regarding autism-related research, and it was formed, as I understand it, to make certain that efforts are coordinated and that we have the most effective possible programs. The IACC's mission is to provide advice on Federal activities related to ASDs, also to facilitate the exchange of information and coordination of ASD activities, and increase public understanding of ASD research and services. However, and I think that, Jerry, Mr. Conley, you may recall when we had government accountability in recently, and they went over a list of some of the major issues and problems with various agencies. In their GAO report to us in November, they stated there was a potential duplication in 84% of the autism research projects funded by Federal agencies, and that better coordination was needed from the IACC, which was actually set up for that purpose. That's a pretty astounding figure, and we want to review that, and that's one of the reasons for the hearing today. So the IACC and other agencies have disputed some of GAO's findings, noting that research projects with similar titles may have substantially different hypotheses, and the growth of scientific knowledge depends on multiple studies that investigate similar research questions at the same time. As I said, we're going to examine, again, some of the points of view on this report. The recently introduced Combating Autism Reauthorization Act of 2014 would change the law to provide coordination between agencies, first by appointing a point person at HHS to coordinate research efforts within HHS, secondly, to require agencies to implement IACC's strategic plan, and then thirdly, adding preventing duplication to IACC's list of statutory responsibilities. So today we're going to look at ways to ensure that the potential duplication in research efforts does not become actual duplication. We're going to look at all the associated testimony that will be provided today, see if we can make some sense out of this and make certain that we are headed in the right manner, again, efficient and effective use of taxpayer dollars in this important area. We'll also take the opportunity to explore how the Federal Government responds to the evolving needs of individuals with ASD within the healthcare and public school system. So, got a number of areas we want to cover today, and we'll hear now from the ranking member, Mr. Conley. Pleased to yield to him.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding today's hearing to examine the Federal Government's response to autism spectrum disorders, ASD, with a particular focus on strengthening the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee efforts to coordinate and monitor Federal ASD research initiatives and treatment activities. I know I've been involved for the last 20 years in my community in Northern Virginia with parents of autistic kids, and and with various support groups. I know that one of the things that plagued families dealing with this challenge was the fact that some insurers, in fact, treated autism as a pre-existing condition. The good news is the Affordable Care Act made that illegal, lifting that burden from parents who are already dealing with many other challenges. On behalf of the millions of Americans and their families living with ASD, I know it is your hope and mine, Mr. Chairman, and our expectation that our expert panel of witnesses will engage in a productive discussion this morning aimed at identifying shared principles around which stakeholders can coalesce and build on to ensure Federal ASD activities are carried out in the most efficient and effective manner possible. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimate, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, that as many as 1 in 68 kids in the United States are living with ASD. That is clearly a serious public health challenge, as millions of individuals battle daily with symptoms that vary greatly in severity and scope, but often involve impaired social interactions, problems with verbal and nonverbal communication, and repetitive behaviors. According to the CDC, it is estimated, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, to cost perhaps as much as $17,000 more per year to care with a child with ASD compared to a child without it. And, of course, those costs arise in the form of medical and non-medical expenses ranging from medicines, therapies, and special education to caregiver time and adult housing. A recent National Institute of Health study concluded the economic burden associated with ASD is substantial and can be measured across multiple sectors of our society, and calculated that the total societal cost of caring for children with ASD exceeded $9 billion as of 2011. In passing the Combating Autism Act of 2006 and subsequently reauthorizing that act in 2011, the Congress began to address the rising rate of ASD and established the IACC to coordinate all efforts within the Department of Health and Human Services concerning ASD. Creating the IACC was an important first step in ensuring that the Federal response responsibly leverages taxpayer dollars to engage in a systematic and comprehensive approach to autism research and treatment activities across government, academia, and the private sector. I am concerned, as you are, Mr. Chairman, that the Federal Advisory Committee Congress established to coordinate ASD activities, according to the GAO, is relying on data that is outdated, not tracked over time, inconsistent, and incomplete, and risks duplication of research efforts, as you cited, Mr. Chairman. Of course, we also must recognize that GAO only addressed potential duplication of Federal ASD activities. So this panel is going to be important in terms of hearing testimony about what actually is occurring. As GAO has consistently stated in these reports, determining actual duplication for research projects would require a more extensive review of voluminous and scientific data and was beyond the scope of the study. HHS makes a fair point in noting that duplication in and of itself is not necessarily a negative characteristic with respect to effectively conducting scientific research activities. I look forward to learning more about the IACC plans to enhance the reliability and usability of the research and the data. Specifically, I hope we will examine how all stakeholders work together to improve the quality of the IACC data, to enhance coordination and monitoring of Federal autism activities, and how the Departments of Defense, Education, HHS, and National Science Foundation will better coordinate ASD research activities to ensure that we get the most bang for our buck from finite taxpayer resources. As the GAO will testify today, I expect, researchers have yet to identify the root causes of autism, and there are no known cures. Thus, it is absolutely vital that we sustain our nation's robust commitment to funding Federal research that may enhance our knowledge of this condition and improve treatment options for families coping with ASD. If there is one singular principle that we can all embrace, surely it is that no family or child should be forced to face living with ASD alone, particularly when we know that early detection and intervention can make a dramatic difference in the quality of life for an individual living with ASD. I look forward to hearing about how we can improve the efficiency and effectiveness of our Federal response. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And we don't have any other members at this point, but members may have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record. We do have Mr. Posey, who, if he would like, could be recognized at this time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's very kind of you. I would like to enter into the record, if I might be able to at this time, from Safe Minds. It's an organization of people who are affected by autism, and it's testimony submitted for the record on the Committee of Oversight and Government Reform, Subcommittee on Government Operations, hearing of May 20th, 2014. As you know—
Without objection, that will be made part of the record. You may proceed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, and you've expressed interest in before, Representative Carolyn Maloney and I introduced H.R. 1757, the Vaccine Safety Act, which calls for the National Institute of Health to conduct a comprehensive study comparing the health outcomes, including the incidence of autism spectrum disorders, between individuals who are vaccinated and those who are unvaccinated. It was announced previously during the April 8th, 2014 Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee meeting that a study of vaccinated versus unvaccinated children is being undertaken under an existing NIH contract with the Lewin Group. While I appreciate that a study is being undertaken, I think it's imperative that it be a little bit more transparent and that the stakeholders should have more participation and input into the process. It's important that all data sets developed as a part of this study at each step in the process be preserved for independent review in the future. I came across a May 15th op-ed by Sally Bernard. Sally is a board member of Autism Speaks and the president of Safe Minds. But more than that, she's a mother of a 26-year-old Bill who has autism. And let me quote from her op-ed. Now a new study of over 2 million children born in Sweden between 1986 and 2006, which has been published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, confirms what Safe Minds and parents have been saying for decades. Children are as much at risk of getting autism from environmental factors as they are from their genetics. The study by Sven Sandin and his colleagues follows on the heels of another landmark study of twins by Håkan Hallemeyer of Stanford, published in 2011, which showed the larger component of autism risk arise from environmental, not heredity factors. Since genes and environment interact to increase autism risks, this means that we're doing something to our children, exposing them to something harmful, either while they are still in utero or during their first months or years of life that is altering their biology. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. Researchers and science policymakers can no longer deny that there is a clear and strong environmental component to the skyrocketing rates of autism. By ignoring the environmental component to autism, the government and scientific committee have made a massive strategic error, wasting enormous amounts of money and time in mostly fruitless genetics-only research that has not helped us stop the new causes of autism or help people living with severe autism. This is a quote. "We can fix this. The studies by Sven Sandin and Håkan Hallemeyer can guide us to the end of the autism epidemic. The good news is that the environmental causes of neurological disorders are more easily fixed than genetics. When we invest in uncovering the environmental factors that are causing our autism spectrum disorders, we can remove those factors from our world. We can study how those factors alter biology and identify the treatments that can remediate those pathways. Based on this latest evidence, funders like NIH should be charging scientists with the urgent task of discovering what the environmental causes of autism are. Clinging to outdated paradigms harms our community. To its credit, the NIH's National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences just released a request for proposals on environmental contributors to autism spectrum disorders. To its discredit, the NIH's Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee continues to obstruct environmental initiatives contained in its own strategic plan for autism spectrum research." End of quote. And I left out mentioning any names in there. This is all pretty serious, and when I listen to what others are telling me and what the GAO report says that we'll discuss today, and the data from the May 7th JAMA article, the message is clear. It appears NIH has been ignoring what parents have known for many years. Environmental exposures in utero or early life are changing the biology of children. Now I'm out of words, out of time, so I'll pick this up later. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you for your participation, your opening statement. And now, without further opening statements, we'll turn to and recognize our panel. Today we have Dr. Thomas R. Insel. He is the Director of the National Institute of Mental Health and the Chair of the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. We also have Mr. Michael Uden, and he is the Acting Assistant Secretary for the Department of Education's Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. And then finally we have Ms. Marcia Cross, and she is the Health Care Director for the U.S. Government Accountability Office. As you all know, this is an investigative committee of Congress and subcommittee, Government Operations Subcommittee you're testifying before. We do swear in our witnesses, so if you'll please stand. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give before this subcommittee of Congress is the whole truth and nothing but the truth? And the record will reflect that all three witnesses answered in the affirmative. Again, welcome to each of you. We have sort of a SOP, standard operating procedure, 5 minutes for your presentation. If you have lengthy testimony or data that you'd like entered into the record, do so through request to the chair. And we're pleased again to welcome and recognize first Thomas Insel, and he is, as I said, the Director of the National Institute of Mental Health and the Chair of the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. Welcome, sir, and you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Mica and Ranking Member Conley. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate your interest in this very important public health issue. As you just noted, I have really two hats here as head of the NIMH, which is the largest federal funder for autism research, and as chair of the IACC, a job that I've had since 2002, so through many different iterations of the Combating Autism Act. You have my testimony. I'm not going to read that, and I hope we can discuss much of what's in there. And I really, in the spirit of wanting to make this more of a conversation and hopefully create a teachable moment here, I'd rather save time for questions and answers rather than taking a lot of time with an opening statement. I would like to make a few comments which probably are not going to be as apparent in the course of our conversation today. One is just to give you a sense of how remarkably fast things are moving in the realm of autism science. Last week was the 13th meeting of the International Society for Autism Research. Really prior to 13 years ago, there was no annual meeting, there was no society. It was a very small research field. Last week, there were 2,000 people from 35 countries gathered together in Atlanta to talk about the most recent findings. It was a 30% increase in the number of abstracts just in 1 year. So we've got a field that is vibrant, that's exciting, that people are moving into. But there are also, of course, huge questions. You talked already, both of you, about the issues around prevalence, and that's a concern that we see broadly. You also both mentioned costs. And it's interesting, your figures were somewhat variant. I think, Mr. Conley, you said $9 billion, and Chairman Mica, you cited $128 billion. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but it's a lot of money. And the question, I think, in front of us is when you have a cost that great and a need this urgent, how much do you invest in science to preempt those costs and to mitigate that public health burden? And that's what I hope we'll have a chance to talk about a little bit today, is not only how we invest and where we invest, but ultimately how much should be invested. What should we be spending on a problem that has grown so much and is creating so much concern in your districts and across the country? For us at the NIH, the good news is that the science is moving so quickly, and there are so many interesting new insights. It's actually at a point now where we believe very firmly that the kinds of investments we're making will soon begin to mitigate these staggering costs and reduce the disability of this disorder. A lot of the science that we're most excited about actually does not have autism in the title. It's the science of trying to understand how the brain develops, developing technologies that allow you to actually visualize brain development even at the molecular level, beginning to see how the brain connects and the role of both genetics and experience and how that happens across both prenatal and postnatal life. Just in the last year, we've seen just what I would call breakthrough technologies like Clarity that give you the first transparent brain with the ability to look at three-dimensional neuroanatomy. We've got imaging techniques that are giving us the most complete architecture of the developing brain. So this is really an extraordinary time. It's also extraordinary for the power of genomics, which is revolutionizing every area of medicine. About 3 months ago, the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics summarized where we are for autism. They concluded that, quote, using current knowledge and technology, a thorough clinical genetics evaluation of patients with ASDs is estimated to result in an identified etiology in 30 to 40% of individuals. That's up from about 5% only 5 years ago. So there's incredible progress. The good news is that both neuroscience and genomics together are actually helping us to begin to pinpoint where the environment must be taking its toll. And all the evidence right now points to mid-gestation, second trimester. What the culprit is or the culprits, we still don't know. But it's because of those kinds of technologies and those kinds of approaches, just as any other area of medicine, we're getting those insights. Just 2 other points to make before I finish. One is that there are some things unique to the autism field that I think really are helpful here. One is NDAR, the National Database for Autism Research. It's a massive effort. We don't really have this in almost any other area except perhaps in parts of the cancer field. NDAR collects the data from over 70,000 subjects, virtually every subject who's enrolled in a NIH-funded research project. Those data are standardized through a data dictionary and shared through the database so that they can be interrogated much more broadly by a wide community. Only in the last couple of months, we've seen the first fruits of that with people analyzing all of the imaging data from many of the different sources and coming up with some new insights. So it's very exciting. The last thing is the IACC, which is what we're here to talk about. And I'll just leave my comments for later, but I think in spite of your concerns around whether this committee has done everything that it set out to do, there are some remarkable achievements, as was pointed out by your colleagues just 2 or 3 years ago in another hearing in which this was used as a model of what could happen in other disease areas where we want to be able to coordinate research better. We've done that in the IACC. We've created some remarkable strategic efforts to show where the science should go, what we can do, and we've monitored that with great detail. So if you can find a better example, I'd love to see it in the whole realm of biomedical research. But as far as I know, and I've been involved with many, many different areas in my tenure at NIH, there's nothing quite like this. So delighted to answer your questions, talk more about each of these issues, but I did want to give you a sense of the excitement that we see from the scientific perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Insullin. We'll get back to questions, but we're going to recognize next Mr. Michael Uden, and he is the Acting Assistant Secretary for the Department of Education's Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. Welcome, sir, and you're recognized.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Mica, Ranking Member Connolly, Mr. Posey, members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today about the role of the Department of Education in providing supports and services to individuals with autism spectrum disorder. The Department supports a wide range of activities in improving our knowledge of ASD, methods of instruction, vocational rehabilitation services, and the skills and qualifications of educators and service providers to ensure that individuals with autism, as well as all individuals with disabilities, enjoy equal opportunity, full community participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. The Department's primary role in supporting services to individuals with autism is through our funding, administration, and monitoring of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. When Congress reauthorized IDEA in 2004, it explicitly included autism in the definition of a child with a disability. My goal is to give you some more information about the kinds of autism supports and services that we're providing students and their families to teachers and the broader community under the provisions of IDEA. So as you know, IDEA serves a very broad range of disabilities and severity in order to ensure that their needs are met and that children are indeed successful. All children with disabilities receiving services under IDEA have an individualized education program, or an IEP, which is developed by a team of stakeholders, which must include the student's parents. More than 30 years of research shows us that students with disabilities do better when they are held to high expectations and have access to the general curriculum. Today, majority of students with disabilities spend most of their time in regular education settings. Therefore, we must ensure that both general educators and special educators have the proper training and tools to provide evidence-based instruction so that students with disabilities have the opportunity to succeed in the general curriculum. IEPs must identify the necessary supports, accommodations, and related services for particular students with disabilities to succeed in the general curriculum, including speech, psychological or counseling services, occupational behavioral therapy, or other school health services that are particularly important to students with autism. For older students, IEPs will also include transition services to ensure they are prepared for life after high school. It's particularly important to have students themselves participate in this transition planning and to learn the self-advocacy skills that are necessary for students once they leave high school to fully participate, meaningfully participate in their communities, enjoy competitive and gainful integrated employment. For our youngest children, Part C of IDEA provides support for screening and early intervention services for children from birth through age 2 who have or may have disabilities or delays. Mr. Connolly, you noted earlier that early screening is absolutely critical to early identification and access to services and supports which can enhance children's learning and development, minimize developmental delays, and result in more positive outcomes in school and in life. The Department also supports children with autism through the training of teachers and related service personnel, providing support for technology development, assisting schools, districts, and states to identify, adapt, and sustain effective school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports, and helping parents and families access the necessary information and the tools to support their children's education. The Department also plays a role in supporting adults with significant disabilities, including ASD, through the Vocational Rehabilitation Program. Through this program, state VR agencies, vocational rehabilitation agencies, provide a wide range of services designed to help persons with disabilities prepare for and engage in competitive integrated employment. Importantly, 35% of VR consumers, of voc rehab consumers, are youth with disabilities. So accordingly, the VR program works with schools to provide youth with critical transition services to ensure that they have the education and the skills to be successful in post-secondary education and employment. We know that individuals with ASD who participate in VR programs can be successful and enjoy higher rates of employment. As I wrap up my testimony, I want to briefly mention our research efforts around autism. It's important to note that our research entities do not conduct biomedical or medical research. First, the Institute of Educational Sciences supports research on the development, implementation, and evaluation of interventions that are intended to improve education outcomes for students with ASD. We know that there are communication and social deficits associated with ASD, but we also know that kids do better in these areas when they have access to non-disabled peer models. Projects include interventions that target social and communication skill impairments that are core functions, that are core features of ASD, transition support for children entering preschool and for adolescents leaving high school, assistance for families and teachers working with children with ASD, and the development and testing of technology applications to support learning of students with autism. And second, the National Institute on Disability Rehab Research, otherwise known as NIDR, supports research and related activities that generate new knowledge and promote its effective use to improve the outcomes of people with disabilities in the areas of community living, employment, and health and functioning. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you, and we'll get to them shortly. now recognize Marcia Cross, and she is the Health Care Director for the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Welcome, and you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Micah, Ranking Member Connolly, Mr. Posey, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here today as you examine the Federal Government's response to autism spectrum disorders. My remarks today are based on GAO's November 2013 report on Federal autism activities and reflect information we included in our April 2014 report on overlap and duplication in Federal programs, and I request that my full written statement be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. From fiscal year 2008 through 2012, 12 Federal agencies awarded at least $1.4 billion to support autism research and other autism-related activities. Funding multiple studies in the same research area can be appropriate and necessary, for example, for purposes of replicating or corroborating prior research results. And multiple agencies can provide a variety of expertise. However, the involvement of multiple agencies can also make it challenging to identify gaps and efficiently allocate resources across the Federal Government. The Combating Autism Act directed the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, or IACC, to coordinate HHS autism activities and monitor all Federal autism activities. The Combating Autism Act also required the IACC to develop and annually update a strategic plan for autism research. This plan is organized into 7 research areas that encompass a total of 78 specific objectives. We identified over 1,200 autism research projects funded by Federal agencies in the 5-year period we examined. We found that 84% of these projects had the potential to be duplicative because they focused on the same objectives in IACC's strategic plan as other projects. That is, each of the agencies funded research in areas that were also funded by other agencies. For example, for one of the 78 research objectives, there were 5 agencies funding 20 separate autism research projects. Having multiple projects related to one objective does not necessarily mean that there is duplication. However, given that all the projects on an objective share a common purpose, this raises the possibility that one or more projects were duplicative. The IACC performs a valuable role in monitoring Federal autism activities and coordinating the activities sponsored by HHS. However, we believe that the IACC and Federal agencies may have missed opportunities to coordinate and reduce the risk of duplicating effort and resources. We found that the IACC was hindered by limitations in the data it had collected. The data were outdated, inconsistent, incomplete, and not tracked over time. Our analysis across multiple years found that some objectives had more autism research projects funded than were suggested in the strategic plan, whereas other objectives were not funded by any agency, raising the potential for unrecognized gaps. In our November report, we recommended that HHS improve IACC data to enhance coordination and monitoring. HHS disagreed and stated its efforts were already adequate. However, we note that the updated strategic plan that IACC released last month includes multi-year data on research projects and funding, which we believe will assist the committee. Lastly, we found that apart from Federal agencies' participation in the IACC, there were limited instances of agency coordination and monitoring. Some agencies lacked formal policies or procedures for checking research funded by other agencies, or for identifying if agencies were funding similar projects led by different investigators. We recommended in our November report that the agencies improve their coordination. The agencies supported improved coordination, but most disputed that duplication occurs. We agree that more information on the specific projects funded within each objective would need to be assessed in order to determine actual duplication. However, neither the agencies nor the IACC has undertaken such a review. In summary, we continue to believe the recommendations we have made are warranted and actions are needed. As established in GAO's recent duplication work, it is important for agencies that fund research on topics of common interest, such as autism, to monitor each other's activities to minimize the potential for the inefficient use of Federal resources. Mr. Chairman, this completes my prepared remarks. I'd be happy to respond to any questions you or members of the subcommittee may have.
Well, we'll start right in. I guess, Dr. Insel, that Ms. Cross gave a pretty critical review of efforts to eliminate duplication. She said there had been some steps taken, but in fact that data was incomplete, out of date. There have been some improvements. Do you want to take a minute and respond generally to her comments?
Well, I think the general comment for me, it's a little ironic. One of the last hearings I was at on the Senate side was I sat with Senator Shelby, and he wondered why we weren't doing more to replicate the science that NIH supports. There's a real concern because of recent reports that not enough replication has been done, particularly of the basic science that is funded by the Federal Government. And so the NIH generally, under Dr. Collins, has taken on a increasing rigor, increasing replication campaign. And so our goal very much is to increase, not to decrease duplication. We want to make sure that more people are working on the same problems, that we're bringing all that data together, and that we can ensure that any finding, such as the recent finding about the disorganization in the cortex that was found in children who had died with autism, so it was a postmortem study, badly needs to be replicated. We just need to have someone else trying to do almost precisely the same study with other material to find out whether that, in fact, can be replicated. In a world in which, to my mind, this is all hands on deck, we need to have 10 times as many people working here across several agencies. I think being concerned about duplication, thinking of that as the problem, is just chasing the wrong rabbit down the wrong hole. That's not the issue right now. I can't imagine, actually, a less relevant problem to the issues that we're all facing. We know so little about this disorder. The key now is how do you get the fuel into this engine with all of these excited scientists, fantastic technologies we have to get this done and to get some answers. And if Congress comes forward and says, you're doing too many experiments, there are too many people working on this, we don't know if it's being done in the right way, we don't know if everybody's maybe doing the same experiment in two different places, as if that's a problem, when we're telling you is, in science, that's precisely what we need. We need more people working on the same problems, and to the extent possible, using exactly the same techniques to see if we get the same answers.
Well, again, GAO is highly critical. They said we've had 1,200 of these projects in 5 years. It doesn't appear that your agency has sorted out, well, also the Interagency Autism Coordinating Council has not, and one of the reasons it was formed was to avoid duplication of effort, try to make certain that the dollars are spent, if it is similar research, and it's that in fact it's justified. But the last criticism you had that you've still not undertaken a duplicative review process, which would sort out any of the repetitive studies that you're saying are so important. How do you respond to that last comment?
So it's a great question, and I think it's really thinking about keeping in mind what a coordinating committee does for us. And you could see our strategic plan where we've gone through this extensive monitoring, as GAO has noted. This is about strategy. It's about high-level planning and figuring out where the priorities should be. Questions about whether funding could be duplicated, how that funding gets distributed, those are tactical questions. And we have an entire staff, not on the IACC. There's a whole program staff. I have 65 in my own institute. That's their job. So for every grant that comes in, They go deeply into, has this been funded before? Is this person being funded by someone else to do the same work? Is there a possibility here that this is redundant and doesn't need to be taken on? So it's a question that gets answered, but not through the IACC. That's not part of the charge, nor is it a coordinating committee that would even have access to the kind of data that you would need, which is pre-award data. So the IACC has a good view of what's been funded. The question you're bringing up, and what I think GAO is concerned about, is a tactical question about how do you ensure before you fund the next grant, what we would call a pre-award state, that something doesn't in fact get awarded that isn't necessary. So we have an entire process for that. HHS responded in their response back to GAO that the reason we don't need to get the IACC to do this is we already have a large staff doing this. One other question that just in terms of the response, as was pointed out of the 78 objectives, there were 4 that actually never got funded by any agency. 74 did and were met to a greater or lesser extent. And it may interest you to know that one of those 4 was actually a recommendation from the IACC that the agencies develop a way to ensure replication research, that we actually find a mechanism to ensure that the agencies are supporting identical research across agencies to get replication, or as you might call it, duplication. That was never funded because we couldn't figure out a way to get anybody to actually support that. But it, again, runs exactly counter to what you're seeing as the problem we're seeing as an essential need. I can't put it in any starker terms than that.
Well, you also alluded to the kinds of investments being made, and then you cited 2 specific areas where you saw that there were either, well, first of all, you said how vital brain research is, obviously. It is important. And then a couple of breakthroughs in genomics, is that the proper pronunciation? And then neuroscience would be the 2 areas I think you identified as getting some promising results. Is that correct?
That's
most
correct.
Promising?
That's correct.
Okay. And you spend about $161 million for research. There's other aspects of this, some NIH, $21 million for CDC surveillance and research efforts. That's a little different. Then we get to the HHS folks. They do research on vocation and other things.
Department of Ed.
Pardon?
Department of Education.
Department of Education, I'm sorry. But again, to the pure science, and the 2 most promising areas of the $161 million, how much is going into those 2 areas?
Well, I'd have to actually take a moment to look up specifically what those numbers would be for autism.
Half,
It's
20%, 10%?
Probably around half would be going into that. There's additional funding for interventions, development for biomarkers, for a whole range of other clinical kinds of studies that NIH supports.
Well, my dad used to say it's not how much you spend, it's how you spend it. And again, we are not in the position of evaluating the science or the research that's conducted. We're getting a critical report and fairly pointed from GAO. Did you want to respond to anything, Ms. Cross?
I would like to respond. Thank you. We have certainly no objection to duplication that is undertaken knowingly and intentionally in order to replicate or validate research results. That's not what we were seeing. We were seeing, not just within an agency, but across agencies, because there were always at least 4 different agencies funding research in each one of these areas, that there was not the kind of coordination that we think is essential to ensure that in this very important area, funds are not being wasted on efforts that have already been undertaken by other agencies, and perhaps in a more rigorous manner. For example, the National Science Foundation, when we first went to them, denied that they were funding any autism research. They are not a member of the IACC, and their information had not been included in previous strategic reports from the IACC. However, it was very simple for us to identify over 30 projects focused on autism that NSF was funding. They were not engaged in coordination with NIH, with the Department of Education, with HRSA.
I don't mean to interrupt, but do they have authority as a coordinating, under their coordinating charter to look at and also determine whether there is duplication?
They certainly have authority to obtain information. The IACC is charged with coordinating all autism activities across the Federal government to gather information on all activities.
And didn't look at NSF.
Not in the earlier years we examined. In the subsequent years, at the time that we were undertaking our work, the IACC was beginning to contact them, and in their more recent report has included information on the National Science Foundation studies.
So that's improving. But it gets back to your last point, which was that they were not conducting a duplicative review overall within, and that should be one of the primary purposes of the IACC, right?
Well, we believe that since they've been charged with coordinating and obtaining information on all activities, that should include all of the agencies that are conducting research. And, that was a primary example. But I think that, to indicate that there's no room for improvement, I think it is not valid. We certainly found room for improvement. We are not making the charge that they are not doing anything useful.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you said that some of this has turned around since you undertook your review and since we've had a report in November and then to Congress in April.
We see some improvement. However,
there's still
we still believe there's room for improvement.
Do you want to respond, Dr.?
I'd love to find somebody who does it better. I'd just love to see the example. I think it's really helpful to put all of this in some context. And the reason why I keep harping on this being the wrong rabbit going down the wrong hole is that when you compare autism to AIDS, it's really quite extraordinary. So as you said, Chairman Mica, that $160 million is being spent in 2012. It's a little bit more than that, but that's basically the autism figures. And you also, both of you, cited the enormous public health costs and economic costs. AIDS affects about 1 million people in the United States. Do you want to guess what the AIDS budget is for research at the NIH? It's $3 billion. We're talking about $160 million for a disorder that affects at least as many children as are affected with AIDS in the entire country.
The question here, I don't mean to interrupt, is you've got 12 agencies now identified with $1.4 billion over 4 years. Is that the correct amount?
Yes, Chairman Mica, that's what we found.
We're just trying to make certain that, again, you have a pretty critical report, not, again, most recently within the last 12 months or so, but
well, let me contest that a little bit and push back. I think the report says there's a potential for duplication in 84% of the research, and they looked at over 1,000 examples. Actually couldn't find a single example where there was true duplication. It's a little bit like if I said on your subcommittee there's a potential for corruption. That's a sort of, presumptive, pejorative comment without actually any evidence to the fact that here's an example where something was wasteful.
Well, and let me go to Ms. Cross, and then we'll get to Mr. Conley afterwards.
By the way, I'm sure Dr. Insel just meant with the exception of those present and participating.
Absolutely, absolutely. Those present are not considered either in a pejorative or presumptive way to be guilty as charged. But this is the problem with the terminology of saying potential, because it suggests that there's a problem when people looked and actually haven't found it.
I think she's beyond potential and identified specifically the NSF instance, and then you wanted to respond.
We did find some instances, but we were not, let's be clear, we were not looking for actual duplication. We did not undertake the kind of detailed review of the scientific hypotheses, the populations being studied, and the methods being used for each and every one of over 1,200 studies. That was not our charge, and that is not what we undertook. We were looking to see, as has all of GAO's recent work on overlap and duplication and fragmentation in Federal government programs, to see whether or not multiple agencies are undertaking similar work on similar populations, and we found that to be the case. We did have brought to our attention a small number of actual duplication that was studies that were occurring, but that's because individuals in those agencies volunteered those to us. So to say that we looked and didn't find it is inaccurate. We were not undertaking the kind of review that we believe the agencies should be responsible for doing when they're putting out Federal dollars.
Well, I've gone over my time. The whole purpose of this hearing, again, is to look at the critical report, see what we think is going on, and then try to make certain that there are corrections in the programs. Let me yield right now to Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this is going to be a spirited conversation. That's great. Ms. Cross, let me begin with you. Is your expertise scientific research?
I am not trained as a scientist. I'm a social scientist.
So you are familiar with the scientific method?
I am.
Have you looked at Federal research dollars in comparable audits on breast cancer?
I have not.
AIDS?
No.
Prostate cancer?
No. We have not been
Leukemia.
requested to do such work by
I'm not
any
asking that
member of
question,
Congress.
Ms. Cross. I'm asking about your experience.
No, we have not.
So you don't have any basis, other than this apparently, for this whole idea of duplication?
I have a basis for how GAO examines duplication across Federal programs.
Ma'am,
I do not
you
have
don't
similar.
Ma'am, you do not have any basis based on what you just said to me and your experience
I do
and
not
this
have-
audit to claim that you come here with expertise on duplication of research, allowing you to opine whether this particular set of research, in fact, stands out, because there's 84% of 1,200 projects at risk of duplication. That's a pretty explosive charge, whether you want to admit it or not, that plays right into the narrative in this body that taxpayer dollars are just constantly being wasted. And when you say that, GAO, you risk legitimate scientific research that can affect people's lives. And that's a very heavy burden when you come here and assert what you assert based on virtually nothing. It's okay to say there's room for improvement. There's a risk of inefficiency. That's true. And we want to explore that. But to go much beyond that is what Dr. Insell's objecting to. And I think he has a point, based on the expertise you don't bring to this table.
Sir?
Yes?
I believe that what we did say is there's room for improvement. There's a potential for duplication.
I'm very well aware of what you said. I heard your testimony. And it was repeated by Dr. Insell. And it was repeated by the Chairman. And what you're doing is playing into the hands of those up here, whether you intend to or not, who actually want to cut back on Federal resources, because all Federal spending is bad. Federal government can't do anything well. And so what you're putting at risk with that kind of statement is legitimate research. Now, maybe there's duplication. Let's examine that. Is duplication per se bad? I thought I heard you say in your testimony, not necessarily.
I said that if it's undertaken intentionally with the purpose.
Oh, it has to be intentional.
Well, I think that if duplication is occurring without knowledge that it's occurring and without an examination of whether or not the results that are achieved are similar or different, then you haven't advanced the science. It's just happening, and it's not being recognized. I think that's a different situation, and that's one that I would be concerned about.
Well, okay. I seem to recall that some very key scientific research sometimes happens even accidentally, through mistakes. I seem to recall a mold that produced antibiotics. I think if GAO were around at that time, you would have criticized them for having a messy lab. And you would have been right. But scientific research isn't always a pure, pristine, clean, non-duplicative process. And there may be lots of different reasons for giving similar research grants to see what they come up with. Because your lab may be different than his lab. Your approach may be different. You may have a slightly different angle that actually leads to dramatically different results. That's how science sometimes works. And sometimes it's a dead end. And when you look back at it retroactively, you go, what a waste of money. But they didn't know that at the beginning, and the effort was an honest one to begin with. Now, there may be some research that is, frankly, not particularly legitimate, and who knows why they got the grant and so forth. But in terms of the scientific endeavor, given the mission we have here, I think Dr. Insel's point is let 1,000 flowers bloom. In this case, let 1,200 flowers bloom. That the risk of inefficiency has to be outweighed with the potential for discovery, for dramatic breakthroughs, not only in detection, but in treatment. And so it's a risk-weighing kind of thing, the scientific method. And it doesn't always lend itself neatly to green eye shade audits, Ms. Cross.
Mr. Connolly, we did not make recommendations for any cuts in Federal funding. We made recommendations for improvement in a more thoughtful and knowledgeable approach to managing the research enterprise across a range of agencies that are working in the same area.
Ms. Cross, I accept that, and I hope Dr. Insel accepts that as a helpful, broad generalization of good management. But you went beyond that. There's something almost insidious in suggesting that 84% of 1,200 research projects over a 5-year period are at risk of duplication. That goes far beyond recommending good management principles. That insinuates that there's something there, though we haven't cited it, and that's Dr. Insel's point. And all right, you didn't look at it, but that's sort of an indictment hanging out there by implication. And I accuse you, I accuse the GAO of being irresponsible when you do that. Well, that is not helpful to scientific endeavor, and it actually damages a very important research component of the Federal Government that's very small compared to other diseases. Because one of the problems we have, Dr. Insel made the point, frankly, sometimes up here, why do research dollars go to particular conditions or illnesses? Frankly, lobbying. It's not based on the prioritization of who suffers from it or, how pervasive it is, or even a careful cost-benefit analysis. It's often based on public pressure. And that's how democracy works. But in this case, we're talking about a very small amount of Federal research dollars. And it seems to me the real issue here is actually getting more resources to this scientific endeavor, not fewer. But I repeat, I think it is irresponsible of GAO to make that kind of statement. The first statement's fine. The second one is insidious. And I don't think you have the qualifications, quite frankly, to make that kind of statement.
Mr. Connolly, I respectfully disagree. I believe our statement was pointing out the portion of the research where there's room for examination.
No, ma'am. You said 84% of 1,200 research projects are at risk of duplication.
Have the potential.
Based on what?
Because they are.
You didn't look at them. You didn't come up with the conclusion that we looked at this, compared it, and it's quite clear there's rampant duplication and inefficiency, and you didn't need to do it that way. You didn't come to that conclusion.
Because 84% of the projects are overlapping across agencies, that was the basis for our conclusion.
Does that mean they're not coordinating?
We found room for improvement in coordination.
Well, okay. There's always room for improvement, even at GAO, Ms. Cross.
Yes, sir.
But the only example I thought I heard you say here today was NSF, because it's outside the penumbra of the IACC, and it was doing its own thing.
Yeah, that's not the only instance where we believe improvements in coordination could occur. We think that that was a clearest example.
Okay, give us
We thought that for example, we found frequent meetings between HRSA and CDC to discuss their research proposal and excellent coordination. However, AHRQ did not take HRSA's advice that the work they were funding was duplicative with work HRSA had already funded. That was an example.
Did you conclude, based on your examination, that taxpayer dollars were wasted?
We did not.
Thank you. Dr. Ansel, you want to talk a little bit about the scientific method? And are you concerned that at this implied duplication and overlap that might mean that dollars could, that there's an opportunity cost, that dollars could have been better focused or targeted but weren't? I guess that's what we're supposed to conclude from this broad generalization from the GAO.
Well, I'm going to rise to defend Ms. Cross a little bit, because after all, her organization.
This isn't personal, Ms. Cross, but it's about. Listen, I've been working on and off up here since 1979, and GAO is a wonderful organization, does great work. But there are times when GAO can't see the forest for the trees because they bring a green eye shade approach to something, forgetting the mission, and not bringing expertise. They can't to every endeavor, but they need to be a little more humble about that sometimes in their methodology. And in this particular case, I'm bothered. I'm really bothered by this report because I think it can do real damage in the current climate up here. It plays right into the hands of the wrong narrative. So we're wasting dollars. We don't need to be investing more. Not that that's GAO's intention, but even GAO can try now and then to avoid being politically tone deaf in a context, especially when something as important as autistic research is at stake. That's my point. Dr. Ansel, sorry.
I'm not sure I have anything to add, Mr.
Well, I was asking you the previous question, and you decided to defend Ms. Cross, and I was telling you didn't need to. But maybe we can return to the subject at hand, which is, are you worried, though? I mean, does she make a point, does GAO make a point, that there is duplication that worries you, overlap that worries you, lack of coordination that worries you, because it's diverting really precious resources that could have been better targeted? Are there examples in your mind as the head of the IACC?
I have a long list of worries, but none of them are on it, none of the things you just mentioned.
Why not?
Because there are so many more pressing problems that we're facing. Again, I go back to the fact that we know so little about this disorder. We know the prevalence is increasing, as both of you have said. Really, this issue is, to me, a complete sidebar. This is not the place to focus.
Okay, but put yourself in the position for a minute of a layperson who sincerely may be concerned and share your concern about let's try to get to the heart of this and better understand it and to be able to develop more effective interventions and ultimately, hopefully, prevention even. And I hear a report that 84% of your 1,200 projects over 5 years are at risk of or potential duplication. That doesn't concern the head of the IACC, that some of those projects may, in fact, be duplicative, because that's the implication.
As I said at the outset, I'm looking for duplication. That's what I think is actually essential to the scientific process. But that is not to say that there aren't ways we can do things better. The IACC is not perfect. We're always looking for input from outside groups. I would say that this particular investigation, because that's what it was over a period of, I believe, 2 or 3 years, at some point began to actually interfere with the very thing we were trying to do. My own staff, I at one point asked them, how much time is this taking? And this ran into hundreds of hours, 20 or more meetings. I mean, it's just an extraordinary burden for people looking for something that ultimately, frankly, they never found. And what you have is a report that ends up saying there's a potential for duplication.
And I'll add, but I mean, is it not true that, sadly, a lot of scientific research, especially in the medical field, ends up in dead ends with the best of intention?
That's the way science works.
Yeah.
If you knew the answer, you wouldn't have to do the experiment.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, just to state for the record, Mr. Connolly consumed 13 minutes, and I consumed about 10 and a half. I just want to add a couple of things here, and I'll count it against time, and then we'll go to Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, we're doubling the time for members on the panel, and then we'll get to Mr. Posey next. Let me just say a couple of things, clarifying. First, I asked the question if this was just a report. I'm not that familiar with all of the history of this issue, but the study was actually mandated by a public law, 111-139. It wasn't a request of members. Is that correct?
The report that we issued in April, where we included information on our November report, was mandated by law. But our original report issued in November was requested. It was requested by Senators Coburn, Ron Johnson, Mike Lee, and Robert Menendez.
Okay.
And it was at their initiative that we undertook
I just
this.
wanted to get the genesis of the study that you were requested to do. That's the first thing. Secondly, I don't want anyone to think that this hearing was organized or its purpose is to cut funding for autism. If there was wasteful money or something uncovered and that was an issue, I think what we wanted to do was, again, I was startled by the April 20, was it 20? No, it's April of this year, yes, and the 2013 report. So when an agency makes a statement like that, that does get our attention. So that's part of the purpose of the hearing. And if we aren't spending money where we're getting the most results, and there was an agency set up in 2006 to try to better coordinate those efforts, then we may have issues. And that's why we're doing this hearing. We want every dollar to be as effective as possible. My side of the aisle, too, Mr. Connolly, we've put Mr. Gingrich, when we took over, we almost doubled some of the money for research. And I'm one of the individuals who feels that you can't, and if it's properly applied and you're doing the research, then look at the billions you could save, the agony, the heartache for these families and these individuals that are affected. So I just want the record to clearly reflect this isn't any attempt to cut funds or to, again, do away with the research that is needed. So with that, let me go to—
And Mr. Chairman,
yeah.
Can I just point out for the record that my friend has now matched, if not exceeded—
That's exactly what I intended to do.
Thank you,
You're not going to get an extra minute out of me.
No, you've always been fair.
I always try to be fair. That's I learned from my first year in Congress from a Democrat member who treated me with fairness and equality, that I would repeat it even if it required me to buy Preparation H. So,
and it's important. It's also important to note that the Chairman's brother was a wonderful Democratic member of this body from Florida.
We all have our issues. Mr. Woodall, you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time, and I appreciate you pointing out that this was not a hearing about reducing autism funding. This is a hearing about making sure that every penny counts. I don't know who represents an area that is not full of moms and dads who want answers and want to make sure that every penny is being spent effectively. And candidly, to Mr. Connolly's point, Dr. Cross, when you have explosive things that come out in a report, I would argue that that GAO report has done more to focus the discussion on autism research and whether or not there are enough dollars there or not as anything. I have not seen the negative undercurrent. I've seen the very positive persuasion. But more importantly, whether doing your work and reaching your conclusions helps the autism research cause or hurts the autism research cause, GAO is not tasked with sorting that out. GAO is tasked with sorting out the answer to the question that in this case 4 senators asked and a law mandated. And I hope that the takeaway will never be that if there is a political point that you can make, that you should make it, or if there is an end that you can justify, you should justify it. We rely on GAO to share the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I am grateful to you all for the work that you do. To that end, thinking about those hundreds of hours that you all invested, Dr. Insel, I kind of think of that as the price of admission. I always hate to see dollars wasted on compliance. That's something that we fight on a regular basis in my part of the world. But when you're talking about $1.4 billion over a series of years, folks do want some accountability, and folks at home don't understand why DOD is working on part of this issue, and DOE is working on part of this issue, and NIH is working on part of this issue. Understanding that accountability is a part of what we all do, using this as the model. Dr. Cross has been criticized for making an observation, but not recommending solutions. You've made an observation about the time involved. Is there a solution to that?
It's essential that people, when they have a question, look at the evidence. I wouldn't contest that for a moment. But what I would contest is the importance of looking at all the evidence. Parts of the report are simply inaccurate or incomplete. There's been an enormous work on looking at the accountability within the autism research funding stream. So we have this recent report, which is really an accountability report of our strategic plan that looks at every single objective, finds out how much was spent over every year, where the money has gone, how does that map onto what was planned. So and none of that, by the way, all of that was available last year. It's only recently been published, but GAO saw that. That was presented at the public meetings that the IACC held. Somehow that failed to make it into the report.
Well, my experience is, and yours may be similar, the report Congress does on its own success generally turned out pretty good. Turns out we think pretty highly of the work that we do. The work that outside groups do on our success sometimes don't come back quite as optimistic. I look at that report. It looks like it was prepared in-house. Is there a similar document that you would hold out as the be-all, end-all of outside examination of the IACC's work?
It's a great point, and it's important to realize the IACC isn't inside, isn't outside. This is made up of a whole range of stakeholders. By the way, they virtually never agree on anything, either with respect to autism or with respect to anything else. So this is their best attempt to take an honest accounting and evaluation of how the funding agencies had done. Half of this group, nearly half, are actually non-federal members, most of them family members, some people with autism itself. They're hardly cheerleaders for either the IACC or for the federal agencies.
Mr. Chairman, I don't want my time to expire without asking unanimous consent to enter the statement of Don Muller in the
Without objection, and you still have 5 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Don is the Executive Director of the Marcus Autism Institute, which is down in my part of the world, and I brag about the work that they do all the time. In fact, our school system that I represent, largest school system in the southeastern United States, has slots prepaid down there because of the work that they do and the importance of being able to find those limited resources available when we need them, because there are not enough opportunities for folks to seek that help. But as I was reading your testimony, Doctor, I couldn't help but notice a reference to some eye tracking technology that sounded a whole lot like some of the things that I brag about coming out of the Marcus Institute. Am I right about that, or am I just a proud public servant bragging about the scientists and folks in his district?
You have every right to brag. That is a spectacular group doing fantastic work, and actually is probably the group that will open up this opportunity to diagnose autism before the first year. And that's a game changer.
When we think about the dollars that go into it, and I appreciate what appreciate what GAO did to help folks to get their minds around the many different baskets that dollars can go into. Candidly, the dollars that we spend on palliative care aren't all that inspiring to me. The dollars we spend on game-changing science, there's not a man or woman in my district who wouldn't say, Rob, I'll write the check. To tell me that what we're doing is making a difference. Tell me that it's going to be a game changer, and I will write the check tomorrow to do more. I think so often when I have conversations with lay people about autism, it is a conversation about treatment of symptoms, not a conversation about changing a life. And if we can use this opportunity and others to publicize it, celebrate it, get folks excited about it. Again, there's just no limit to the power of the American people to invest in ideas that will change the future. To Mr. Connolly's point, yes, folks are worried about government waste, and the potential duplication is something that folks have on their mind. But we would not have the opportunity to talk about the ideas that we celebrate. We wouldn't have an opportunity to talk about the successes, at least not in this forum, but for the law's mandated report, the Senate's requested report. I'm grateful that we've had that time. Let me ask you, Dr. Cross, Director, Health Care. You've heard Mr. Connolly's criticisms of what I would call the standard GAO process, right? This is what we fund you to do. Hearing those concerns, knowing that generally as we look around this room, this is a group of folks who all agree on the goal and who all want to get to that goal as soon as possible. Is there a tool that the GAO does not have in its quiver? Is there an arrow that is not in the quiver that you would have liked to have had to do something different in this report? Or did you do this report right the first time, given the mandate, and you would do it exactly the same way again?
I believe that we did exactly what we were requested to undertake, and that aligned with the mandate we've been given and the approach that is being used to look at fragmentation, overlap, and duplication that can occur across the Federal Government. If it has come across as tone deaf, that certainly is not our intention. We try to be very clear, and we try to be very precise in what we say and in what we don't say. And again, we did not call for reductions in funding. We did not say that the dollars being spent on autism research were wasteful.
Would my friend yield?
Be happy to yield.
I thank my friend. I just note for the record that, GAO, we rely on GAO a lot. But sometimes GAO, they're fallible too. They don't speak ex cathedra. I recall a situation where GAO reported that there were 56 federal financial literacy programs, and that went viral. They were wrong. There were not. They had to go back, and they admitted that, well, actually, maybe there were 12 or 13, but the damage was done. That's the concern I have. I thank my friend.
They're always looking for those areas of agreement, and certainly this research is one of those. I think Mr. Connolly is absolutely right when he talks about the power of that lobbying has in making these decisions. I will tell you, Dr. Insel, when constituents come and ask for an earmark or a plus up in this area of NIH or that, I always tell them that we have tried to hire the absolute finest folks that the world has to offer. And if you believe that a lawyer trained out of the University of Georgia has more to offer to scientific research than the best minds on the planet, I'm happy to start making those decisions. But our goal is to find the very best folks, put them in positions of responsibility, then take every penny that we can find to dedicate in that direction and allow those folks who see where those areas of opportunity are to dedicate those dollars appropriately. I am grateful to the coordinating work that you do. I know you could be doing many other things with your time, but none that would have a greater impact on the men and women that I serve back home in Georgia, and I'm grateful to you for it.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Massey, did you have any questions at this time? I'm sorry. Mr. Amash, I don't know why I did that.
No, I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. There is a distinct difference between the two members, and I apologize. Then we'll go to Mr. Posey, who had unanimous consent to participate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Insel, let me say that I think you're a good man. You're well qualified for the job, and you have good intentions. And I hope that the discussion about the direction it's going is not something that you're taking personally. Some folks, and I'm one of them, believe that the government and the scientific community has made a strategic error by mostly focusing on genetics-only research. I'm just finishing up my opening statement here, basically. It seems NIH is clinging to outdated paradigms, and IACC leadership, for some reason or reasons, has obstructed progress in researching the environmental initiatives that are actually listed in the IACC's own strategic plan. Those have been underfunded, while genetics have been funding at around threefold the recommendation. I'm interested in knowing what, if any, changes Congress and the parents can expect to see from the IACC.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Posey. If I can, just to put this in context, because often there's some confusion about what we mean when we use the term genetics or genomics. If just put autism aside for the moment, and you look at disorders that we study that are major public health problems that we know have a very clear environmental cause. Lung cancer, asthma, those are two pretty good examples. If you looked into the NIH funding for those, it's heavily dominated by genomics. Now, we know there's an environmental cause for lung cancer, and we know the same for asthma. So what are we doing studying genomics? The reason is because in 2014, genomics isn't about necessarily just finding a cause. It's a tool. It is the engine for discovery. It's given us a way to faster, better, and cheaper figure out mechanisms of disease. And sometimes that takes us in ways and places we had never expected to go. But
okay,
to say that
my time's run out here. Are mostly the studies that they were talking about being redundant on genomics? Do they have the same goals? Do they have the same metrics? Are they being measured by the same metrics? Are they using the same techniques?
I'm not sure that I'm aware of projects that were thought to be redundant on genomics. In the area of genomics, everything that we do, not just in the United States but around the world, filters into a single site called the Database for Genotypes and Phenotypes, dbGaP. Okay. And so all of that has to be standardized to use exactly the same techniques and to provide the same kind of data.
Thank you. Your job is much broader than simply autism. And in the last 4 years, you are not only director of the National Institutes of Mental Health, but also the acting director of the newly formed National Center for Translational Medicine. Realizing there's only so many hours in a week, a day, I'm curious about how much of your actual time outside of IACC meetings do you spend singularly focused on autism?
That's a great question. My wife asks me that quite a bit, actually, because the hours are there, but on the percent basis, it's not, at this point, the majority of my time. I have lots of other things that I'm responsible for. I have to say that the part of the reason I have focused as much as I have on autism for the National Institute of Mental Health is because increasingly we think about this as the prototype. Okay. Today we think about schizophrenia, bipolar disorder.
Would you say it's an hour a week, 4 hours a week?
Oh, no. It's got to be more than that. I'd have to sit down and actually look at my calendar, but it's probably tracks pretty well with our funding commitment. It's probably about 10% of our funding, and I suspect it's about 10% of my time.
Okay, and if you find differently, if you'd send a committee back and
I'll be happy to provide something for the record.
one of the findings of the GAO was the potential for duplicative research, which has been a big topic up here today. Who at the NIH actually makes the final funding decisions on autism research grants?
It's certainly not the IACC. It's the institute directors at the NIH who are responsible for their own budgets. In this case, there are 6 different institutes that have some commitment to autism. 5 of them are on the IACC.
Would you send me a list of them and their names?
Absolutely. We'll provide that for the
and their budget amounts.
Yes.
Is there coordination between NIMH, the Child's Health Institute, and other centers and institutes on what will and won't be funded?
Yeah, there's a separate parallel group called the ACC, the Autism Coordinating Committee, which is made up of the program officers at each of those institutes, those and others as well, deafness as well. They get together on a regular basis, at least once a month. They hash through their portfolios, both what they have and what's coming in, and make decisions about what the funding should look like going forward.
Thank you. Will you send me a list of all those players and who they represent?
Absolutely. We'll do that for the record.
I know that before the final decision, there's a review by experts of grant applications. The IACC members do not have grant review authority the way that the typical advisory body for centers and institutes do. It was announced on April 29th in the Federal Register that the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development Special Emphasis Panel, Outcomes in Autism Spectrum Disorders, Mechanisms and Needs Assessment, would be meeting on May 6th in a closed-door meeting to review grants. I'm wondering who serves on this and other special emphasis panels that review the body of autism grant applications at the NIH.
There are 2 tiers of review at the NIH. One is the one you just described, which is the level of usually scientific experts, but sometimes public members as well, to look at scientific merit for the grants that come in and to rank them. The second tier is it then goes to a body called the Advisory Council, and each institute has one of these. They go through that entire list with people from program, look at both scientific merit, public health needs, and also programmatic balance, and help the institute director to make a final decision about what should get funded.
Thank you. Would you please provide me in writing the name and staff positions so I can kind of get that straight on a chart?
Right. We can lay that out for you. Would you like that for the institutes that handle autism research?
Everybody that touches it.
So that would be the members of council for each of those institutes. That's actually public record.
Both layers, yeah.
Well, so I should just clarify that the review committees, of which there are several, in this case, the one that you referenced is what's called a special emphasis panel.
Correct.
So that's put together for just this particular review on this particular request for applications. We can certainly provide you with those names. Those are, of course, public. But we'll get you that for all of the recent requests for applications. We just had 3 for NIMH, and we'll make sure you have those names.
Thank you. It just wasn't in our package, and so it may be available, but you know, you can put your finger on it in 5 minutes and take my staff 5 days, just as a practical matter.
It's not worth 5 days. We'll get it to you.
Okay. Would you please provide that list, their bios and CVs and financial disclosure forms?
And again, all of that is public record for government employees and the institute directors and council members. All of that is available for members of special emphasis panels. I'd have to check to find out whether they are vetted in the same way in terms of their financial disclosures. I believe they are, but I actually have to look at that, and we'll let you know that for the record.
Okay, thank you. Are there any parents of individuals with autism included in the review process?
Well, at NIMH, we've had a tradition of doing that all the way from the ERA funding, where they were a large part of the review, to now having generally a member, usually a parent, who sits on our council at this point, or sometimes it's actually a person affected by the disorder. The most recent parent of a person with autism was Portia Iverson, who sat on the NIMH council until about 2 years ago. This rotates around, so the other public members, I don't know that right now, we do have one parent of a person with autism, but that's not something that is public. But the people are chosen to serve partly to provide that kind of perspective. Now, this is at the high level. This is at the council level that's making the final decisions on an advisory basis.
Yeah. Somebody from Autism Speaks, for example, what would be their odds of being on that review panel?
So for that first level, Tier 1 scientific review, there's if they don't have a conflict with applications coming in, we're always looking for people who can bring scientific expertise to that discussion. At the second level, at the higher tier, Portia Iverson was the founder of Cure Autism Now. So, that's somebody who was deeply involved in the advocacy community. So it's, again, NIMH covers many disorders. It's not just about autism, but we've tried to make sure there's someone with an autism focus on the council so that those grants get a very careful look.
Okay. Have there been any discussions of public grants to balance out the private sector grants?
That's a terrific question, and it's something we haven't talked about so far, but as the NIH funding has gone down about 25% over the last decade in terms of purchasing power, we've been fortunate that there's been an increase in private investment. The Simons Foundation, Autism Speaks, the Autism Science Foundation, those three really making a difference and helping to buffer what has been a very difficult period for the NIH. The way that gets coordinated is through the IACC, so we would love to have members or leadership from each of those private groups on the IACC. They have been there until recently. Rob Ring was just appointed from Autism Speaks, but he has not yet attended any of the meetings that will happen. Because of turnover at both Autism Speaks and Simons Foundation, we've lost their representation, but that's going to be repaired very quickly.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I hope we do another round.
Well, I'm not sure how much additional time we'll have. I had a couple of questions. Mr. Turner, did you have anything at this point? He's just joined us. Let me just ask a couple of questions I didn't get to before. And I was trying to look at, the most promising areas, and I talked about the neuroscience and how do you pronounce it?
Genomics.
Genomics. I had heard you mention some research, maybe I was wrong, about the second trimester. Could you elaborate on that? And is that another promising area?
Well, as Congressman Posey pointed out in his opening remarks, there's virtually no expert who would doubt that environmental factors are important for autism. We don't know yet exactly what those are, and that has got to be a major focus going forward. The few that we do know about do point us towards the second trimester as the point at which they act. So whether it's drug exposure, sometimes prematurity, other events, other kinds of exposures, even one that's been purported for pollution. When you map those factors onto development, it's not postnatal, it's not early prenatal, it's really right in that period around 12 to 24 weeks that we're most concerned. But what is it? It's probably many things. And how do we get our hands around that, and how do we help people to know what to avoid when they're carrying a baby at risk? Those are the questions that we haven't yet answered.
Well, one of the things that, if you could provide us for the record, I'd just like to have in the record, and I'd ask you some of the money we're spending in the more promising areas. Maybe you could just give us a little breakdown of guess estimates in the most promising areas for the future. I think that's important to establish for the record. And then, again, we want to direct as many additional funds to where you have the promising research or results. Again, if you wouldn't mind providing that. Then you started talking about data collection, and I guess you're getting better at it. And what is it, NDAR?
Yes, sir.
How old is that data collection system?
So NDAR was started, I believe, in 2005, just built as an infrastructure. It's taken a while to grow it. We're up to over 70,000 individuals with an ASD diagnosis and millions, actually over billions of records. We're just seeing the first fruits of that as people.
And how much money are you spending on data collection?
It costs us about $3 million to build it. It's about $1 million a year to make.
Is that adequate? I mean, again, well, your sampling is somewhat small, 70,000, considering the population, and then the data collection is, I guess, has become more sophisticated. Did you all look at that, Ms. Cross? No?
We did not look at that, no.
But I think that's also important, building a accurate database. Well, if you could, again, provide to the committee any information on where we might make improvements. If we don't have enough funds for data collection and we aren't expanding that base of knowledge. So I think those are my questions at this follow-up questions at this point. It's just important that you talked about the kinds of investments, and we want to make certain that we are investing properly, that if we don't have the coordination that we need, that we achieve that.
And again, sir, just to make sure we're clear on this, I would push back against the sense that we don't have sufficient coordination. I don't think that's the problem. And as I said at the outset, I don't know that there's any disease area that does it better than autism. The problem is we just don't have enough
It's also been held up as a model, too, of what we've done with the IACC. But again, where we have some differing of opinion, and that's what the hearing's about today, and making certain that we are targeted and focused adequately. Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have two follow-ups. One quick question for Dr. Insel. Ms. Cross pointed out that NSF is not part of the IACC and kind of was doing its own thing. Why isn't it part of IACC, and shouldn't it be?
It would be great if they were. They feel that their mandate is in basic science, that autism is a clinical problem, and this is outside of their lane. The fact is they work on issues like robotics that we think could be extremely helpful for the autism community. Outside of the IACC, we have a lot going on with NSF.
Yeah.
In fact, we have joint funding efforts with them in computational science and other areas.
But here, and I do credit GAO, Ms. Cross pointed out, initially they said, no, we're not doing any autism research, and GAO discovered, well, actually they were doing about 30, I think you said. So it just seems to me, Mr. Chairman, that's something we may want to follow up on. I'm not sure it ought to be NSF's decision whether or not they are part of the IACC.
Love to have your help on that. That'd be terrific.
I think that's a follow-up, definitely, Mr. Chairman, if you want to work together on that. Mr. Uden, just one question. I've known lots of families who have autistic kids, and for 14 years I was in local government and helped finance and oversee the 12th largest school district in the United States. And you talk about the best policy is try to integrate these kids into the general curriculum, and that's a noble goal. But practically, most teachers have no training whatsoever in dealing with autistic kids, and it can be very challenging. There are all kinds of issues depending on the spectrum. So what are we doing to provide that kind of training so that teachers are not afraid, not intimidated, not wanting to avoid this integration in the general curriculum? Because if that's the goal, the key is teachers who are trained and familiar and embrace that goal too.
Thank you, sir. That's a fantastic question. We know that research shows that kids with disabilities do, in fact, do better when they have access to the general curriculum and are held to high expectations. As you noted, as everyone knows, autism spectrum disorder is, in fact, kids have autism on the spectrum. So there's a range of severity, a range of individual needs, interventions, services, and supports, across that spectrum. We've invested in a number of efforts in research-based strategies such as positive behavior interventions and supports. PBIS is what it's known, and it's a school-wide effort that sets a framework for behavior. It sets clear expectations for behavior. Teachers are trained on it. Parents are trained on it. The school cafeteria workers are trained on it. Bus drivers are trained on it. And if implemented with fidelity, has fantastic outcomes that address a number of areas around behavior, around office referral, around suspensions, around attendance, around engagement, and ultimately around academic support. So I would start with that framework that is a solid research base that is really making a difference in classrooms all across the country. What it also then does is frees up specialists, whether they're special ed teachers or counselors or psychologists, to then really work with kids that do have more intensive behavioral needs. We support a technical assistance center on intensive interventions that works with states and districts to provide those research-based tools and strategies.
Mr. Posey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, please don't mistake me for advocating that we abandon genetic or genomic research. My question was just why the environmental-based research was funded at much less than the recommendation, and the genetic research was funded at 3 times more than the recommendation. What would you recommend to improve the relevance research funded by NIH to families?
Can I get you to unpack that question a little bit to get some sense of...
All right. How many of the therapies currently that are typically used by the autism community have been evaluated by NIH research grants?
There's a robust cohort of efficacy trials looking at a variety of interventions, both behavioral and biomedical interventions, pharmacological and devices. But as you probably know, the range of what's being used in the community is vast. And in the absence of anything that seems to truly work in randomized controlled trials that has been shown to be effective and rapid and accessible, people are reaching for all kinds of things. So we do have effective behavioral interventions. At this point in 2014, remarkably, we have no pharmacological treatment for the core symptoms of autism, and that is extraordinary.
Yeah. Okay. Some years ago, NIH staff informed this committee that a chelation study would be conducted to evaluate its benefits in children who test for high levels of heavy metals like lead, mercury, and cadmium. Do you know if that was ever conducted?
I know that there was a proposal to do such a study in the NIMH intramural program, and my recollection of that, this is many years ago, was that it did not make it through the institution review board process, that the IRB felt that it was difficult to do that study under the ethical constraints based on the information they had. Okay.
The previous question about the research grants, could you also give us a list of those?
I'm sorry, just to clarify the question about research grants, a list of...
On therapies currently typically used by the autism community. You said there were a number
absolutely.
of them.
And again, all that information is also in this tome that has recently come out that it looks at the accountability of the strategic plan. I should, because I didn't respond directly to your question about the proportion of the budget that's going to genetics versus environment, in the realm of looking at environmental risk factors, more than half is either on the environment, specifically on gene-environment interactions, or epigenetics, which is a mechanism by which the environment would have that impact. So that's in excess of $30 million that go into that area.
Okay. And this is just out of curiosity. Has NIMH or NIH funded studies looking at the use of vitamin B6 in children with autism? Are you aware of that?
I'd love to take a look at that for the record and let you know. I don't know offhand of such a study.
there's a question of why there haven't been studies of whether autism prevalence is higher in children who received versus did not receive one of the 7 vaccines administered in the first year of life, and how you can legitimately state that vaccines don't cause autism studies until the actual studies are conducted. And I'm not saying you, I'm saying anyone, you know, that's not a personal statement. You know, put aside all the criticisms about how to do the study. Where do you come down on that?
Well, this may be, again, a place where GAO might have suggested that there has been some duplication. There's been an enormous amount of focus on this topic over a long period of time. I have never counted the number of studies, but I know that there's even today, yet another report out, a large meta-analysis out of the University of Sydney, looking at 10 different projects that have looked specifically at this question about the role of vaccines, and again comes up completely empty-handed. There's just no evidence there. So how much more needs to be done there? How much do you want to continue to bang away at that question? Personally, I think the environment's an important factor here, but it's probably going to be prenatal, not in the first or second year of life.
Well, are you aware of any studies that we've done that have not been tarnished by the touch of Paul Thorson, that conclusively have done a blind study of versus vaccinated versus unvaccinated?
Well, those are two different questions. There's been an enormous amount of epidemiological work, not just in the United States, but around the world. And part of what the report out of Sydney describes is that effort. The question about doing a prospective vaccinated versus unvaccinated clinical trial came up at a previous hearing, and I think that's going to be a tough one to get through an institution review board to tell parents in a random way that you're not going to be allowed to vaccinate
okay,
children.
Let's stop it right there, because every time we've ever talked about doing one of those studies, some idiot in the media says I'm suggesting that children intentionally don't get vaccinated. And I don't know that anybody has ever proposed that. But there are plenty of children whose parents will not allow them to be vaccinated. There are plenty of cultures where children are not vaccinated. And there are other reasons children aren't vaccinated. And there are children who take large doses of vaccination, and children whose parents decide to have them take one vaccination at a time to avoid thimerosal. And I've not been able to ascertain that there's actually been a legitimate study done that wasn't tainted by the touch of the international colossal scumbag, Paul Thorson.
Well, perhaps I can reassure you a little bit on that score. I agree with you that there are a lot of parents today who are choosing not to vaccinate, and that does provide maybe the unenviable opportunity to ask, does that matter? We are trying to do that through a very large study of 35,000 families with autism in a very large healthcare system, where some of the families have decided, when they have a child with autism, not to vaccinate their next child. Mm-hmm. And the question will be, two questions actually. Does that make a difference? Does that next child have a greater or lesser possibility of developing autism if they are not vaccinated? And the second question is, are they more likely to develop preventable medical illnesses as a result? I guess the other question I keep wondering for myself, since we've already done this, we don't have the data yet, but we will very soon, is if the results come out negative again, will people accept that answer?
Absolutely. If it's a transparent, bona fide study, I think no matter where people fall on the issue, what side, they would be relieved at a credible, transparent conclusion. Yes, I think everyone would be relieved regardless of what the results are. They just want to see a straight arrow, bona fide examination, study, and conclusion. And I don't think they want anybody to invent anything. I mean, I've talked to hundreds of mothers personally, And I'm sure there's thousands and maybe millions that I haven't talked to who have said, you know, my child, usually a little boy, was absolutely perfectly normal till the day after he got his vaccinations. And through a related career, I've got a little bit of experience with mercury. And, you know, I know that if we find mercury in our fish, we shouldn't eat them. And I think the spectrum causes are very wide. I think this is one of them. I think genetic enhanced foods are one of them. I mean, we change the genetics of what we eat and don't expect it to change our genetics. I mean, you know, there's so many things. I think pollution goes into it. I mean, we know that it harms children who eat lead pipes. I mean, clearly that where children have eaten lead off the pipes, it's harmed the children. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for it, but one heavy reason that I hear often about is the thimerosal and the vaccinations. And I think it would be great if the government, who's here to do good things for people, would take that off the table, but not in a way that we met and we did this and we did that, but in a very public way, in a very transparent way. You could, I think, remove that question forever with just one decent, highly qualified, respected study.
Sir, if you'll permit me, as soon as we get the data in a form that has been accepted for publication, I'd love to sit down with you and go through them, and we can do that.
I'll look forward to it.
One-to-one, and let you see what that looks like. I'm interested to see it myself, and we'll know that, I think, in the next 3 months.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, let me go over a little bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Posey, for attending and participating. And I also want to thank our three witnesses for their participation testimony today. Without objection, we're going to leave the record open for an additional 7 days, and we have additional questions that we will be submitting to some of the witnesses for responses for the record. There being no further business, I do want to thank everyone again for participating. Raised a lot of important issues. Looked at some of the study results from GAO and heard testimony from the IACC representative. And again, sorting through this and making certain that we are doing the best possible with taxpayer dollars is our goal, and hopefully we can get closer to finding both the cause and prevention, and help a lot of people who have had to struggle through this the terrible problems brought about by autism. So with that, there being no further business before the Government Operations Subcommittee, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.